All right, so it's 7:30. We can start the session. Carl, thanks a lot for joining this session and all the attendees as well. We see 80 plus attendees on the call. And you can ask questions through the Q&A panel on the on Zoom, the bottom of your screen. And we'll be sharing the videos in a few weeks on the YouTube channel of Virtual Dreaming for all the sessions. And over to you, Carl.
Thank you. Welcome to 10 Steps for Building Awesome Architect Artifacts. So for those who don't know me, my name is Carl Brundage. I am a master architect at Odiseva. We are an ISV partner available on the App Exchange that adds customer trust to Salesforce through data protection, data privacy, and data operations. Within the Salesforce ecosystem, I'm a certified technical architect, MVP, analytics champion, and co-leader of the Allentown, Pennsylvania Developers Group. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter. Before I jump into my content, I do want to say thank you to our sponsors. Their generosity has made it possible for us to all come here today. And if you're also feeling generous, please head over to Mercy Corps and consider making a donation to them in honor of virtual dreaming. So what are we going to cover today? Well, I think a good place to start is really thinking about why artifacts matter. And then, like any good architect problem, we're going to ground our solution based off of a set of requirements. So I have a company for us to look at together. We're going to build out a system landscape together, as well as an object model, and then have time for wrap up and questions at the end. So the question that comes to mind is, why do we even care about building artifacts? As an architect, we have lots of crazy ideas in our head, and we have to find some way to pull them out to solve the solution that a customer has and effectively communicate to the other party. If we think about something like the solar system, right? The solar system is very vast. It's hard to maybe conceptualize the planets and their sizes and where they are. So we have models of the solar system that pulls it together with planets that revolve around the sun. So just in the same way, we're going to take our designs and put them into these artifacts, these models, and present them to others so that they can more easily understand what we're thinking. So for today, I have a company called the Conference Company, TCC. And what they do is they put on conferences around the world, and they want to consolidate and automate their processes. They have a lot of manual processes and spreadsheets that need to be resolved. Within the TCC, there's some things that are going on. They have over 2 million attendees that pre-register and come to their conferences. So think of these conferences if we were here in person, like TDX or Dreamforce, same type of concept. Along the way, they have thousands of businesses that act as sponsors. So just like we have sponsors for virtual dreaming, TCC will sign up sponsors. Within the company, there's 3 types of users. There's account managers. These are folks that will work to obtain sponsorship from other businesses. There's meeting planners, the MPs. Well, they design the whole conference. They decide what sessions are going to happen, who's going to be speaking. And then last but not least, you have customer support agents who provide support to individuals when we have trouble or need help logging into the system. And currently, TCC does have a few systems in place. Not everything is manual. There's a custom SQL Server-based logistics planning app, and that also supports single sign-on, so they can sign in with some existing credentials. For payment processing, well, this conference is free. What TCC puts on is not. There's a payment gateway that can do credit card processing and can communicate with REST. And then finally, there's an on-premise LDAP system that authenticates both employees and sponsors. So if we kind of drill into some of the requirements that people have and talking to them, well, those employees, they want to track everything in one place. They also want to use their current network credentials and access other apps without another login. And nobody wants to remember something else that they need to keep track of. Likewise, AMs, they're assigned sponsor requests based off of the geographic location, since this is a worldwide company. The AMs will send out customized documents to the sponsors. But this is what your sponsorship package looks like and how much it costs, and they get an electronic signature. Those meeting planners, well, everything is in their logistics app, so they need to create sessions and people inside of there. And then finally, they want to keep information private. You should only see the information from sponsorship or conferences based off of who's assigned in your territory. On the other side, when you think outside the company, the sponsors have some requirements too. They want to say, hey, I'm interested. Let's see what we can work on together to come up with a sponsorship package. They will look at different offerings. So there may be things that are tied to sponsoring a banner or a coffee break. A AM will review that interest and communicate back and forth with the partners that are qualified. And then after the conference is over, well, they want to know, was this conference successful? Did they get a return on their investment? And then us as attendees, there's things we want. We don't want another login. So it'd be nice to register and log in with Facebook or Google. We want to review and select sessions, pay with our credit card and view our receipts for reimbursements, submit a request for help online. And then when we get to a session, if we're coming in person, we want that mobile app to do geofencing. No more scanning badges to go in rooms, just automatically decide where we attended or not. And then keep us informed along the way. We want some personalized emails or texts about the conference. So a couple pages of requirements, but we'll use this to build a solution. So the place I like to start is I like to start with the system landscape. And the reason I do that is it really provides a broad overview of the systems and how they interact together that are going to make up my solution context. And because we're talking about Salesforce, I start with a Salesforce-centric view and put Salesforce right in the middle. Now what we can do is we can identify other systems that come in. Well, we talked about having a place where users are going to connect. Well, that's probably a mobile app for a lot of people, and that's not something that I necessarily want to put in Salesforce. I think Heroku might be a good choice. I heard mention of payment processing. Again, I could maybe retire that system, but Salesforce isn't the best choice for credit card information or payment processing. There's a lot of partners out there that have already solved it. Similarly, we talked about creating documents and sending them for signature. I know there's DocGen and e-signature apps that are available from the App Exchange. So I'm going to reuse some solutions there instead of rebuilding. That logistics app, since it's so core to the business of TCC, that's not something I'm going to get rid of today. I'm going to keep it as part of my system landscape. But I need to make it communicate with Salesforce. And based off the fact that people need real-time access, an enterprise system bus makes the most sense. And last but not least, we have our LDAP, our credential store, where information about who is in the system and who can log in is stored. So at this point, I like to ask myself a question. Did I get all the systems? Because there's some things that can be tricky and can kind of be hidden. I'm going to start with LDAP because that's just a credential store. That's actually not a way to authenticate into Salesforce. So instead, I need an identity provider that sits on top. Likewise, I drew Heroku as a place that's going to interact with my mobile app, but I didn't put that mobile app there itself. We're going to need to authenticate the user to figure out who's geofencing, so we definitely want to identify it. I had mentioned the need for social sign-ons. While those will be set up inside of Facebook and Google, we still need to integrate and have them available inside of Salesforce. And we have kind of forgot about the current system. I know we're retiring it, but it's important to draw out that we are going to need to take data from these spreadsheets and existing manual processes and get it in to load up the new system. And to do that, an ESB is great for real-time communication, but a handy-dandy ETL tool can be the way that we're going to load Salesforce to start. So at this point, I can add some additional detail to make this diagram a little bit more impactful. One of the things we're going to do is we're going to retire the current system. So I'm going to show it on the future landscape by crossing it out. I like to put a firewall on my system landscapes. This really helps people think about what's sitting inside of the premise of a company like TCC and what's completely encased in the cloud. Things like the App Exchange or the social sign-on, we can just call out where they're coming from, find out what's in a particular context. And then my users. So one of the things I add to my system landscape is a set of users and what license they're in, because Salesforce is kind of a big term now, and depending on the license, you can access different things. So the account managers will be Sales Cloud, the CSAs will be Service Cloud, and the meeting planners, well, they'll probably just need custom objects so they can be platform. So those make up my internal users. And likewise, from an external user perspective, I have customer communities and partner communities. Now, you may have kind of seen things come up in random places and like, why are you creating such a crazy diagram? Well, that's really just my style. I know that if I'm looking for credentials, it's always in the bottom right, and App Exchange is in the top left. So it's very easy for me to look at one system landscape to another from customer to customer and see what's going on. And it also helps me as a mental check to see, did I miss something? You know, I'm used to seeing a current system. Oh, it's not in that place where I like to see it. I must have missed something. Now, the other thing we can do is we can make Salesforce be a little more specific. So instead of saying we're going to use Salesforce, we're going to use Sales Cloud for the account manager, Service Cloud, and Platform. We also have Community Cloud coming in for that personalized communication. Marketing Cloud comes into play. So I think we have a pretty good listing of systems that are going to be in TCC solution, but now we need to add the interactions. So I like to think of how data is going to flow through the system, right? We're going to start with the current system, move it to the ETL and into Salesforce. And then through the LDAP and identity provider, people will need to log in. They're going to access the logistics app in order to pull information back and forth to set up the different conferences. Next, our sponsors will probably want to log in. They'll be able to build their package, have it signed. Our attendees start registering. They're going to have payment information going back and forth. And then finally, when you're on site, you can use the mobile app through Heroku in order to check in automatically. So now we have how the systems are going to talk to each other. The last thing we can do is we can add a little bit more information and we can talk about how the systems are going to interact. So I would probably load it up with the bulk API. You're going to use SAML in order to authenticate. Next, talking to the logistics app, well, that could be SOAP or REST. Likewise, the app exchange partners, most likely your SOAP. Social sign-on is OpenID Connect. We're going to have REST to communicate to the payment gateway, but then OData to keep the information there and just expose it. And then last but not least, we can use REST to talk to the Heroku. So we have one picture now that has a lot of information that talks about this is what a system is going to be. We can use it with our customer to have those conversations. So now let's think about the object model or the data model. This is going to define the entities or the objects in Salesforce and how they relate to each other that's needed to hold all of our data. So I've started by drawing out some of the standard objects, but then adding some custom objects that I think I'm going to need in order to solve these challenges. So things like we're going to need accounts and contacts to hold our sponsors and the people with the sponsorship. We're probably also going to need person accounts to hold our attendees. When they first express interest, there'll be a lead. When we think they're qualified, we can turn it to an opportunity as well as opportunity product because there's different pieces of information. I like to make sure I'm complete in my data model. Opportunity product by itself, well, we have to have the product. And that comes from having a product, price book, and a price book entry. We think about now the conference themselves. There really isn't a great object in Salesforce to hold that. So we'll probably create a custom conference object, sessions that link to it. And then after somebody decides that they're going to attend a conference and pays, they can register for the session attendee. And then finally, when they come on site, they'll check in. And if they never need help along the way, case. So we have a mixture of custom and standard objects here. I also like to enhance it. I talked about using person accounts. So I'll draw a dotted box around account and contact to show that there's some places where I'm using it as a person. Other times I'm using it as a business account. And I also have the record types on there. So the next thing, I'm using arrows, which I did on my system landscape. That's really not the right connotation to use on an object. We need to show how these items relate to each other. Are they in a one-to-one, a one-to-many relationship? So we can use a different style. I particularly like to use crow's feet notation, something that shows you're going from one account to many opportunities. You can use the one-to-many. You can use inverted arrows, whatever style suits you. The other thing that's really important when we're talking about Salesforce is the type of relationship we're using, right? Because if we were going to use something like a master detail, where we go from conference to session, well, that means some things from a security model. We can't have session have an owner. We can't share sessions by themselves. It's going to follow the conference. So this is where we can start putting together and making sure that our design is entirely consistent. The other thing when I stop and look at this, it's really not easy for me to tell what's standard, what's custom, what may be something special, like a big object. That's where I like to add color or shapes if you don't want to use color. So now it's pretty easy to see everything in blue is a standard Salesforce object. Everything in orange, I've created custom. I have payment as an external object that doesn't reside in Salesforce, and then green for a big object. Now, just don't forget when you add colors, make sure you add a legend, or if you're using shapes, make sure you add a legend. So when somebody comes to it, they understand what you've decided to show because your nomenclature may not match something that they're thinking of without that. Now, at this point, what I want to do is I want to start thinking about security because in Salesforce, Who can access what is so fundamental to how your system works. So what I'll do is I'll consider having the owner of each type of object on the diagram. And I'm not talking specifically Bob is owning this or Mary is owning this, but rather what's the role? So something like our business account is owned by the account manager, or our person account is owned by the CSA. The other thing we have to be careful of is those master detail relationships, right? So something like conference that's owned by a meeting planner, when we go to the child, well, that's controlled by the parent, so there's not a separate owner here. The other thing that we can add in this spot is what our org-wide defaults are. So we mentioned an important requirement that our users can't see each other's information. So we'll do things like keeping the sessions, keeping the contacts private, keeping the opportunities private. But something like the conference, well, everybody needs to know what the conference is and what sessions are offered. So that's public freedom. Don't forget unique objects like price book and product that have atypical sharing models, such as use or show, and things like external and big objects, which don't have the security model. Last but not least, when we're looking at Salesforce, we need to think about data volumes, right? Because if we don't build a solution that works both today and in the future, we haven't done our job as an architect. So what I'll add is a rough idea of the data volumes. We're not looking to be perfect. It's not a problem if you have 1,250 leads, I only said 1,000, but the order of magnitude matters, right? If you have 2 million contacts or 20 million contacts, that's a pretty big difference. So if we start looking through here, most of our data volumes are pretty much okay. 2 million contacts, 10,000 conferences. But then if we start thinking about it, well, there's probably 10,000 sessions and people that come to a session. We could be looking at something like 5 million session attendees. So that's an area where we need to think about how we're going to mitigate large data volumes, whether it's custom indexes or skinny tables or some of our other tools. And likewise, something like payment has a lot of volume, but we're keeping it off platform. And big object, 100 million, there's no way we put that in a standard object, so it's an appropriate use there. So again, we took a kind of simple object model and put some common nomenclature in it, and then enhanced it to make it even more readable. What we did in both cases is we strive for what's known as information density. The idea that we're going to take our picture and we're going to make it 1,000 words. So it's easy as a starting point for somebody to understand what you're thinking and have a conversation around it. Now, a lot of times I'm asked about diagramming tools, and there's a variety of those out there depending upon what you want to use. You have Visio available, Lucidchart on the web, even Draw.io, OmniGraffle, Glyphy Diagram. There's probably more that you like. PowerPoint can be a little bit difficult to build these. So what I say is you take one of these tools and you'll start building resources out where you have your library of objects and starting points like the standard objects that you can reuse. So at this point, I think we have an opportunity to have a few questions. I'll leave up the code while we have the questions coming. So there was some question about licensing consideration. Tells us there's a suggestion about using campaign in place of conference. And then probably licensing consideration tells you not to use campaign. So yeah, that's part of the decision process as an architect where you can go through and look at different things. If I had campaign, I would need to give people Sales Cloud. If I had a custom object, well, then I could use the platform license for those meeting planners. So again, we didn't talk a lot about the process to get to the right solution. Rather, when you have that solution, what you use to communicate it to folks. Do you have any templates for artifacts or activities architecture normally undertake as part of the project you can share? So I don't have specific templates that get you started in different areas. I know I've done things with Lucidchart where if you're going into an existing org, you can actually connect the Lucidchart and pull out the object model and it'll create it for you, which is a nice handy jumpstart. What I do find I end up happening is I build my own library of these icons. Like I'm not going to look for the Sales Cloud or Service Cloud, App Exchange icon. They end up living inside of my diagramming tool where I can readily reuse it from project to project to project. Likewise, the standard objects, usually if you diagram them once, I'll leave them in a starting template that I can then copy and use as a starting point for my next project. So question about recommendations for making diagrams readable, more white space versus compact, easy to display on one page. So for this presentation, I have compacted them a little bit. I think it's okay to go in multiple pages. What I try very hard for is, especially in the object model, not crossing lines the best that I can. So if I have to jump lines going from one object to another, it starts being very hard for a user to understand. So I will work with where I put a particular object to avoid that. I also try to have relationships leave on the right side and enter on the left side. So sometimes it does have kind of a snaky relationship, but it makes it easier for somebody to look at, well, what side do you want to start and then move forward. How much time do we have left for questions?
We have like 3-4 minutes.
Okay. So another question, what time frame do you measure for data volumes over? 1 year, 5 years? So I tend to look at what the customer's planning horizon is. And what I mean by that is it's generally longer than a 1 year plan. Most companies are thinking, hey, what are we going to do over the next 3 years, maybe 5 years. They also will have signed some type of agreement with Salesforce. So their Salesforce licenses are good for 3 years or 5 years. So I'll try to align with that. If you go much further than 3 to 5 years, what business is going to look like then can be very difficult. You may have some questions about, well, are you going to acquire companies? Are you going to grow at an exponential rate? So you do plan out in the future, but you can only go so far before the assumptions that go into your model are just so completely wrong that your numbers are either crazy high or unrealistically low. So that generally finds out a good time, 3 to 5 years. So a question about, do you augment your diagrams to suit the type of stakeholder you're interacting with, IT versus business? I find it challenging to show the same. So a lot of times, if we think about some of the diagrams I showed, what you can do in the diagramming tools is you can set layers that you can turn on and off. So for example, if I'm talking to a business, I'm not talking to them to tell them that it's a SOAP API or SAML. So I could turn off the layer, but I certainly would talk about systems that they're used to connecting to and show arrows going back and forth. Likewise, from an object model, the relationships probably don't matter. The privacy does, who can see what, because you get into questions there around, oh, wait, I don't expect to be able to see somebody else's opportunities or cases. And then the same thing, some of the other data volumes I will usually leave on because people will have that as a frame of reference. So there's a question about tooling. So I have some references there for how you want to go through and do it. This one was Draw.io. I have used Lucidchart in other times. Let me see if I can find one more. So diagrams you showed are useful, but what about UML? So there's a time and a place for UML. Certainly as you go deeper into a project, I think it can be appropriate. These oftentimes are the diagrams that are used at the very start of it. Hey, I'm thinking about migrating to Salesforce. I have these existing systems. What does that look like? So it may be in the sales process, it may be in the very early planning stage of an implementation, where you have to decide what's staying, what's going, how are these things going to interact together. Yeah, absolutely. When you get down to the nitty gritty of how's the system going to communicate, what is it, a request dot response, is it asynchronous call out, you can go into other level of details with things like UML. So I think at this point, thank you for the Q&A. If there's other questions, feel free to connect with me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, in the success community, and I'll be happy to continue the conversation there. Thank you very much. Have a great virtual dreaming.
Thank you, Carl, and thanks a lot to the attendees as well. And this video will be on YouTube shortly, in a few weeks' time, and you can review this later on as well. Thanks so much for joining.